On May 11th, 1960, in a quiet suburb of Buenos Aires, Argentina, a middle-aged man named Ricardo Clement stepped off a bus after finishing his shift at the Mercedes-Benz factory where he worked as a mechanic. He was unremarkable in every way, the kind of man you would pass on the street without a second glance, living a modest life in a modest house with his family, going to work every day, paying his bills, causing no trouble. He had been living under this false identity for 10 years, blending seamlessly into the community of German expatriates who had settled in Argentina after the war, maintaining the perfect camouflage of ordinariness that had allowed him to evade capture for more than a decade. But as he walked toward his home on that ordinary evening, a team of Israeli Mossad agents seized him, bundled him into a car, and within days he was on a plane to Israel, drugged and hidden, smuggled out of Argentina, to face trial for crimes that would shock the world when the full scope of them was revealed in court. Because Ricardo Clement was not who he claimed to be. He was Adolf Eichmann, the man who had organized the logistics of the Holocaust with such efficiency and dedication that he had become known among Nazi leadership as the virtuoso of deportation, the maestro of murder, the bureaucrat who had transformed the abstract goal of the final solution into concrete train schedules and deportation orders that sent millions of human beings to their deaths. And yet, when he stood trial in Jerusalem in 1961, when the world finally got to see the man who had been one of the primary architects of genocide, what they saw was not a monster, but something far more disturbing. They saw a balding, middle-aged man with glasses who spoke in the dry, bureaucratic language of an administrator, who presented himself not as a fanatic or a sadist, but as a dutiful civil servant who had simply been following orders, doing his job, fulfilling his professional responsibilities in the transportation and logistics department of the Third Reich. He showed no visible signs of sadism or cruelty, expressed no hatred for his victims, claimed no ideological passion that had driven his actions. He was, in the words of political philosopher Hannah Arendt, who covered his trial, the embodiment of the banality of evil, the terrifying demonstration that the greatest crimes against humanity can be committed not by monsters driven by extraordinary malice, but by ordinary men driven by nothing more than careerism, obedience, and a desire to excel at their assigned tasks. Welcome to Forgotten Minds. Today, we dissect the psychology of Adolf Eichmann, the logistics expert who proved that you can organize the murder of millions without hatred, without passion, without any emotion at all beyond the professional satisfaction of a job well done, and in doing so revealed something profoundly disturbing about human nature and the structures of modern bureaucracy that allow ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil while maintaining their self-image as decent, law-abiding citizens, simply doing their duty. Adolf Eichmann was born on March 19th, 1906 in Solingen, Germany, the eldest of 5 children in a middle-class Protestant family. His father was an accountant who worked for a tramway and electricity company, a respectable position that provided comfortable but not wealthy circumstances for the family. When Adolf was 8 years old, the family moved to Linz, Austria, where his father had taken a new position, and it was in Austria that young Adolf would spend his formative years, attending school, making friends, preparing for a future that seemed to promise nothing more dramatic than a continuation of his family's modest middle-class trajectory. And here is the first unsettling fact about Adolf Eichmann. There's nothing in his childhood or adolescence that suggests the trajectory he would eventually take. He was not abused, not traumatized, not subjected to any of the early experiences that psychologists typically identify as risk factors for violent or antisocial behavior. He was not a troubled child who tortured animals or set fires or displayed early signs of sadistic pleasure in causing pain. He was, by all accounts from those who knew him, a normal boy, perhaps a bit unremarkable, not particularly distinguished in any way, but not troubled either. Just an ordinary middle-class child growing up in early 20th century Austria. He was not an exceptional student, did not excel academically, dropped out of technical school before completing his engineering degree, failed in his first attempts to establish a career. He drifted through various jobs, working as a labourer, then as a salesman for an oil company, never quite finding his footing, never quite achieving the kind of success that would mark him as special or significant in any way. His early adult life was characterized by a profound ordinariness, a lack of direction or purpose, a sense of being adrift in a world where he had no particular talents or achievements that would distinguish him from thousands of other young men of his generation and class. What is psychologically significant about this period is not what was present in Eichmann's personality, but what was absent. There is no evidence of a strong internal moral compass, no indication of deeply held convictions or principles that would guide his decisions regardless of external circumstances. There is no passion or calling, no burning ambition or clear vision of what he wanted to accomplish with his life. What emerges from the biographical record of young Adolf Eichmann is a portrait of someone who was empty at the core, who had no firm sense of who he was or what he believed, who was waiting to be filled by whatever ideology or organization or authority figure came along and offered him a role, a purpose, a way to transform his insignificance into significance. This psychological emptiness, this absence of a solid internal identity, is actually more dangerous than active malevolence, because it creates a person who is infinitely adaptable to external demands, who can be shaped into whatever role is required, who has no internal resistance to orders or ideologies that violate fundamental human decency, because there is nothing inside to resist with. Eichmann was not evil in any active sense, not driven by hatred or sadism or a desire to cause suffering. He was simply hollow, a vessel waiting to be filled, and the tragedy is that what filled him was Nazi ideology and the bureaucratic machinery of genocide. In 1932, at the age of 26, Adolf Eichmann joined the Nazi Party, not out of passionate ideological conviction, but for reasons that were primarily practical and social. He had lost his job as a travelling salesman during the economic collapse of the Great Depression, was unemployed and directionless, and a family friend who was already a Nazi Party member suggested that joining the movement might open up employment opportunities and provide the sense of purpose and community that Eichmann so obviously lacked. The decision to join was not a moment of ideological conversion, but rather a career move, the choice of a man who had no strong convictions of his own, and was willing to adopt whatever beliefs would provide him with stability and opportunity. In 1934, Eichmann was transferred to the SD, the intelligence service of the SS, and assigned to the department dealing with Jewish affairs and emigration. And here, finally, after years of drifting and failure, Adolf Eichmann discovered something he was genuinely good at. He threw himself into his work with the dedication of someone who had finally found his calling, studying Jewish culture, and even learning some Hebrew, becoming what his superiors considered an expert on Jewish matters, building files and databases, creating organizational systems for tracking and managing Jewish populations. He was not motivated by hatred of Jews, but by the professional satisfaction of doing complex administrative work efficiently, of taking chaotic information and transforming it into orderly systems, of proving through his competence that he was valuable and skilled. When Nazi policy shifted from forced emigration to systematic extermination, when the final solution was decided upon at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, Adolf Eichmann was there as a relatively minor functionary taking notes, and yet he would become absolutely central to the implementation of genocide because he had the organizational skills and the bureaucratic knowledge to transform the abstract decision to murder all Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe into concrete logistics that could actually be executed. He became responsible for coordinating the transportation of Jews from across Europe to the death camps, for working with railway administrations to schedule trains, for organizing deportations in cooperation with local authorities, for solving the endless logistical challenges involved in moving millions of people to their deaths. And Eichmann approached this work with the same professional dedication and attention to detail that he had brought to his earlier assignments, with the pride of a craftsman perfecting his trade. He kept meticulous records, created efficient systems for processing deportees, worked long hours to ensure that trains ran on schedule and that quotas were met. When complications arose, when local authorities resisted deportations, or when railway resources were needed for military purposes, Eichmann negotiated and problem solved and found solutions, motivated not by ideological passion, but by professional pride, by the desire to demonstrate his competence and value to his superiors, by the satisfaction of overcoming obstacles and achieving the objectives that had been assigned to him. This is the psychological mechanism that allowed Eichmann to participate in genocide without experiencing moral crisis or psychological breakdown. He'd completely separated the means from the ends, had transformed a moral catastrophe into a technical problem, had reduced human beings to units to be transported and processed according to schedules and quotas. When he thought about his work, when he experienced satisfaction in successfully organizing a complex deportation or solving a logistical challenge, he was not thinking about the millions of people being murdered, but about the elegance of his organizational systems, the efficiency of his processes, the recognition he received from his superiors for his competence and dedication. The human reality of what he was doing was completely absent from his consciousness, replaced by abstract metrics and procedural concerns that allowed him to maintain the self-image of a hard-working, skilled professional, doing his job to the best of his abilities. When Adolf Eichmann stood trial in Jerusalem in 1961, the world expected to see a monster, expected testimony and demeanor that would reveal the kind of extraordinary evil that could explain extraordinary crimes. What they got instead was something far more disturbing and far more illuminating about the nature of evil in the modern world. They got a man who spoke in bureaucratic clichés, who described genocide in the language of transportation logistics, who claimed no particular malice toward his victims and expressed his actions in terms of duty and obedience and professional responsibility. Throughout the trial, Eichmann insisted that he was not an anti-Semite, that he held no personal hatred for Jews, that he was simply following orders and doing his job within the system he found himself in. He presented himself as a small cog in a large machine, as someone who had no real agency or choice, who was simply carrying out directives from his superiors. He claimed that he had never personally killed anyone, that he had simply organized transportation, that the actual killing was done by others and was not his responsibility. He portrayed himself as a victim of circumstance, as someone who had been caught up in events beyond his control and who had simply done what any dutiful civil servant would do in his position. But the testimony of survivors and the documentary evidence presented at trial revealed a different picture. They showed that Eichmann had not been a reluctant participant, but an enthusiastic one, that he had taken initiative in solving problems and overcoming obstacles to deportation, that he had exceeded his orders and pushed for more aggressive implementation when local authorities hesitated. They showed that he had negotiated with Hungarian authorities to accelerate deportations, even as Germany was losing the war, and resources were desperately needed elsewhere. They showed that he had continued organizing deportations right up until the end, even when it was clear that Germany was defeated and that he would face accountability for his actions. The picture that emerged from the trial was of a man who had found meaning and purpose through his role in genocide, who had experienced professional fulfillment and pride in organizing the murder of millions, not because he hated his victims, but because the work itself, the complex logistics and organizational challenges, gave him the sense of competence and value that he had lacked throughout his early life. His evil was not extraordinary but banal, not the result of demonic malice, but of ordinary careerism combined with moral emptiness, and the willingness to subordinate all ethical considerations to professional advancement and bureaucratic efficiency. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial for The New Yorker, coined the phrase, "the banality of evil," to describe what she observed in Eichmann, and this phrase captured something essential about the nature of genocide in the modern world. The greatest crimes against humanity are not committed by monsters who are fundamentally different from the rest of us, but by ordinary people who are willing to participate in evil systems, because those systems offer them careers and purpose, and the satisfaction of doing their jobs well, by people who have abdicated moral judgment in favor of obedience and technical competence, by people who can organize mass murder without hatred or passion, simply because it is the task they have been assigned, and they take professional pride in doing it efficiently. On May 31st, 1962, Adolf Eichmann was hanged in Israel, the only execution ever carried out by the State of Israel. His last words were reported as a defiant assertion that he did not believe in God or an afterlife, that he would not beg for mercy, that he remained loyal to his ideals. His body was cremated and his ashes scattered at sea, outside Israeli territorial waters, so that there would be no grave that could become a shrine for neo-Nazis. He died maintaining to the end that he had simply done his duty, that he bore no personal responsibility for the deaths of millions, that he was a victim of history rather than one of its greatest criminals. Adolf Eichmann teaches us something profoundly disturbing about human nature and about the structures of modern society that allow ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil. He demonstrates that you do not need to be a monster to commit monstrous acts. You do not need hatred or sadism or even particularly strong ideological conviction to organize genocide. All you need is moral emptiness, professional ambition, and the willingness to treat moral questions as technical problems, to be solved through efficient administration. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Eichmann to organize the Holocaust are not unique to him or to Nazi Germany, but are general features of how bureaucratic systems function and how people adapt to roles within those systems. The compartmentalization of responsibility, where everyone is simply doing their assigned task and no one person feels responsible for the final outcome. The abstraction of victims into statistics and categories that strip away their humanity and make them easier to process without emotional engagement. The transformation of moral decisions into technical problems that can be solved through expertise and efficient procedures. The prioritization of career advancement and professional recognition over ethical considerations. These are not aberrations, but normal features of how large organizations operate and how people function within them. What protected most people from becoming like Eichmann was not superior moral character, but simply the absence of circumstances that would test their willingness to participate in evil. Most people with bureaucratic competence and professional ambition never find themselves in positions where those qualities can be employed in organizing genocide. Most people live in societies with functioning moral and legal constraints that prevent the kinds of systems that the Nazi state created. But the capacity to become like Eichmann, to subordinate morality to efficiency, to treat human beings as logistical problems, to find professional satisfaction in organizing evil, exists in far more people than we would like to believe. The lesson of Adolf Eichmann is that evil in the modern world is not primarily the result of exceptional malice, but of ordinary people doing their jobs within systems that have abandoned moral constraints. That the greatest danger comes not from obvious monsters, but from competent professionals who are willing to set aside ethical considerations in favor of technical efficiency and career advancement. The path from ordinary bureaucrat to architect of genocide requires no transformation into a monster. Only the willingness to treat morality as irrelevant to professional competence, to divorce means from ends, to reduce human beings to abstract categories that can be processed without empathy or moral consideration. This has been Forgotten Minds. Remember that the most dangerous evil is not the kind that announces itself with obvious malice, but the kind that disguises itself as professional competence, not the passionate hatred of fanatics, but the cold efficiency of bureaucrats who have learned to separate their actions from their consequences, their technical skills from their moral responsibilities, their career ambitions from their human obligations. Until next time, stay vigilant.